The man from Denver ran his thumb along the lariat for a long time before he asked its price. This was the 10th of December, 1949, a Saturday, with the wind coming down off the Laramie Range at maybe 15 miles an hour, and the fence posts still cold enough to bite through a glove. He had a creased gray hat and a coat that cost more than my truck, and he had come out from the rodeo grounds in Cheyenne on nothing more than a rumor somebody had passed him at the stock pens, that a kid 14 miles out was braiding rope leather better than anything he'd seen shipped up from Texas. He did not introduce himself first. He picked up the second lariat and then the third, turning each one in his hands the way a man turns over a coin he suspects might be counterfeit, except he was checking the other direction, checking whether it could really be this good for what he guessed I'd charge. I told him the price. He didn't argue it. He asked instead how many I could have ready by March, and when I said I didn't know because I had never made 40 of anything in my life, he wrote a number down on the back of a feed receipt anyway and told me to find out. I want to say I felt something large in that moment, some turning over of the ground beneath a life. I don't think I did. I remember mostly that my hands were cold and that I was doing arithmetic. 40 lariats, $12 each, $480, against $600 my mother owed the Stockman's Bank of Cheyenne for a winter that had nearly finished us both. I remember the wind, and I remember that the rope in his hands had been, 11 months before, a scrap of cowhide trimming that a tannery in town had paid me $3 a wagon load to haul away and bury. That's where the story ends up going, if you want to call it an ending. But it didn't start on a rodeo Saturday, with a stranger's hat and a receipt full of arithmetic. It started 9 years before that, in the fall of 1940, when I was too young to drive the wagon myself, and my father still did, hauling scrap hide out from the Cheyenne Tannery because it was the only cash that came in easy that time of year, and because burying trash for $3 a load beat not having $3 at all. My father died in the spring of 1946. On a Tuesday I still don't like to talk about, and the hauling became mine along with everything else on those 340 acres. The sheep, the cattle, the debts, the ledger with his handwriting trailing off 2/3 down a page he never got to finish. Nobody in Laramie County thought an 18-year-old could keep that outfit standing past one bad winter. For a while, they weren't wrong to wonder. The winter of 1948 into 1949 was the one that nearly proved the county right. Snow came the second week of November and didn't let up in any real way until March, and by January, I was feeding hay I didn't have to 90 head of sheep that huddled against the north fence like they thought the barn was a rumor. 2 ewes died in a drift behind the loafing shed, and I found them stiff as fence posts when the thaw finally showed their wool. The vet bills that followed, scours in the lambs, a case of foot rot that spread faster than I could treat it, ran higher than any season since my father died, and by the time the frost broke, my mother was carrying $600 of debt to the Stockman's Bank of Cheyenne, feed and vet charges mostly, with her name on the note, because mine wasn't old enough to mean much to a loan officer. I remember the banker's face when I went in that April to ask about extending the note instead of calling it. He had a mustache he was proud of, and a way of tapping a pencil on the desk that told you he'd already decided before you sat down. He said something about how a boy my age ought to think about selling off half the cattle and leasing the rest of the ground to somebody established, somebody like the Hollenbecks, 2 sections over who'd been running stock in that county since before statehood. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. What I did instead, that summer and into the fall, was keep hauling scrap hide out of the tannery same as always, $3 a load, same as it had been since 1940, and burying most of it in the ravine behind the east pasture because burning it stank up half the county when the wind was wrong. It was a chore I did without thinking, the way you don't think about breathing, load the wagon Tuesday mornings, drive the 14 miles into Cheyenne, dump the scrap where the tannery man pointed, take my $3, drive home. 9 years of that. 9 years of hide trimmings that could have been rope or harness or something worth 10 times what I was getting, going into a ditch to rot or burn, and me none the wiser, because nobody had ever told me different, and I'd never once thought to ask what the stuff was worth to anybody but me trying to clear space in the barn. It took a blind woman at the feed store, in October of 1949, lifting her head at the smell coming off my coat, to ask the one question that changed the arithmetic of the whole outfit. Her name was Opel Kesler, though I didn't learn it that day, only found it out later from the woman behind the feed store counter, who said it careful, like it cost her something to say it plain. What Opel Kesler said to me, standing near the burlap sacks of chicken feed with her cane against her hip, and her face turned toward me the way blind people turn toward sound instead of sight, was, "You're the boy hauling for my brother." Not a question. I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she nodded, like she'd already known the answer, and was only confirming a fact she'd carried a long while. She said the scrap on my coat smelled like cowhide trim, not tannin, which meant it hadn't been soaked long enough to ruin, and that her husband used to say, a man could tell the worth of a hide by how long since it left the vat. I didn't know what to do with that. I said something about how it was just scrap, ma'am, going to the ravine same as always, and she made a sound in her throat that wasn't quite a laugh. "Going to the ravine," she said, like she was tasting the words to see if they were true. "My husband braided rope out of trim thinner than what you've got on you right now. 30 years he did it. Sold harness leather to half the outfits between here and Torrington." I stood there, holding a sack of oat feed against my hip, 14 miles from home still to drive, October wind coming through the open door smelling like frost and diesel, and I didn't say anything for a while because I didn't have anything worth saying. She wasn't looking at me, couldn't, but she had her head tilted the way you tilt it when you're listening past a person to something behind them, and I understood later that was just how she always stood, faced a little off from wherever the voice was coming from, like sight was a habit she hadn't fully let go of even 9 years gone. "He's been dead 5 years, she said. "The knowing didn't go with him. It's still in my hands." She held them up, not far, just to the height of her waist. 2 hands that looked soft, the way old hands look soft, veined and spotted, nothing about them that said rope or leather or 30 years of work. "Nobody's asked me for it." I said I had to get on, ma'am, wagon to unload before dark, and she said, "All right, boy, go on then," like she hadn't expected anything different, and I drove home that evening the same 14 miles I'd driven 1,000 times before, except I kept thinking about her hands the whole way, and about the ravine, and about 9 years of burying something I'd never once stopped to ask the value of. I didn't go back to town for 11 days. There was work that had nothing to do with hides, a fence line on the north pasture that needed restringing before the ground froze hard enough to make the post holes a 2-man job, and I only had the 1 man, which was me. I mended it alone on a Tuesday, the wire cold enough to bite through gloves, and I thought about her hands again somewhere around the 4th post, not because I meant to, but because there wasn't much else in my head out there besides wind and the sound of the come-along ratcheting tight. My mother asked me at supper that week what was keeping me quiet, and I told her nothing, which wasn't a lie so much as an unwillingness to say out loud a thing I hadn't decided was real yet. She had the bank letter from Stockman's propped against the sugar tin on the shelf where she kept bills she hadn't paid, $600 of it, feed and the vet, who'd come out twice during the bad stretch of 48 into 49, when we lost 11 ewes to something the county agent never did put a name to. She didn't mention the letter, neither did I. We ate and she asked about the fence, and I told her it would hold through spring, which was the truth as far as I knew it. It was a Saturday, the 22nd of October, when I went back into Cheyenne. Not for feed, I'd already stocked what I needed, but I told myself I was checking on a part for the farmall at the implement dealer on Warren Avenue, and that was true too, in the way things are true when they're also an excuse. I found her house on Cedar Street before I found the part. It was small, white paint, gone gray at the corners, a porch with 1 chair on it, no others, like nobody had ever expected company past the one person who lived there. I sat in the wagon across the street for longer than I want to admit, and did not go up. What decided me wasn't courage. It was arithmetic, the kind you do without meaning to. 9 years, $3 a load, maybe 40 loads a year hauled off and burned or buried in that ravine behind the south fence, and somewhere in that same span, a woman 2 miles from my gate who knew, by her own account, how to turn what I was burning into something with a price on it 10 times over. I got down from the wagon. I crossed the street. I knocked, and I heard her before I saw her, moving slow across a floor that creaked in the same 3 places every time, and she opened the door before I'd said a word, like she already knew the weight of my boots on her step. "You're the boy from the task place," she said, not a question. Her eyes were open, but they didn't move to find me, didn't track the way sighted eyes do when a stranger stands on the step. They stayed fixed somewhere past my shoulder, on the street, on nothing. "You still smell like the Tannery. I told you that in October, and it's November now, and you still smell like it." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "November the 9th. You know the date, that's something. Most men your age can't tell you what day it is without a newspaper in front of them." She stepped back from the door, one hand finding the frame the way a man finds a fence post in the dark, sure of where it would be before her fingers reached it. "Well, come in if you're coming. I'm not going to stand here and let the cold decide it for you." The house smelled of wood smoke and something else underneath it. Oil, an old kind, the smell that hangs in a barn where saddles have hung for decades. There was a chair by the stove, and she pointed to it without looking, and I understood then that she had counted the room, knew every board and object in it, the way I knew my own pastures without needing to walk them. "I had a husband," she said, before I'd sat down all the way. 31 years he worked hide with his hands. Rope, harness, halters. Men came from as far as Torrington to buy off him because there wasn't finer work between here and Denver. And when he died in the spring of '44, I buried what he knew along with him, because nobody asked me for it. Nobody thinks to ask a blind woman what her hands remember. She sat across from me, folded her hands in her lap, and for the first time turned her face toward mine, though her eyes still didn't find me. "Your wagon's been going past my brother's tannery for how long?" 9 years, I said. "Since 1940. "And what's he paid you?" $3 a load. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "My brother," she said, "never once in his life picked up a hide and thought about what was still in it. He inherited a building and called it a trade. You've been hauling off gold and burying it in a ditch because nobody told you otherwise, and I have 31 years of a dead man's hands sitting in mine with nowhere to go." She held them up then, turned them palm up toward the stove light, and I saw how the fingers curled slightly, permanently, shaped by decades of pulling hide taut. I can't see a braid anymore, but I remember every one I ever watched him make before the fever took it from me. If you're willing to let an old woman put her hands over yours in the dark, boy, I can teach you what's worth 10 times what my brother's paying. I told her yes, before I'd thought through what saying yes would cost me in kerosene and evenings, and she nodded, like she'd already known the answer before she asked the question. That was a Tuesday, the 18th of October, 1949, and the wind outside the feed store had picked up enough that the door kept working itself loose from the latch. I remember the storekeeper watching us from behind the counter, not saying anything, weighing feed sacks he didn't need to weigh. She told me to come to her house on Thursday evening, the 20th, and to bring nothing but a hide that hadn't been oiled yet. I drove out to the tannery that same afternoon and asked the foreman for a scrap load off the top of the pile instead of the bottom, which was where they usually let me dig, and he looked at me like I'd asked for something out of turn, but he let me take it anyway, $3 changing hands the same as always. Her house sat on the edge of town on a street I'd passed 100 times without knowing whose it was. Small, white clapboard gone gray at the corners. A woodpile stacked too neat for a woman who couldn't see it. She answered the door before I'd finished knocking, which I found out later was because she'd heard the wagon wheels a quarter-mile off and timed herself to it. The front room smelled of neatsfoot oil and old smoke, and there was a workbench pushed against the far wall that hadn't been touched in what looked like years, dust thick enough to write in. She sat me down at it and had me lay the hide flat, and then she reached across the table and found my hands the way a person finds a doorknob in the dark. Not fumbling, just direct, like she already knew the exact distance. "Cut with the grain first," she said, "not against it. Feel where it wants to go before you make it go somewhere else." Her fingers closed over mine on the knife handle, and I felt the old ridges in her palm, hard as harness leather themselves, guiding the blade in a line I couldn't have found on my own. She didn't watch what I did. She couldn't. She felt it through my wrists, through the small hesitations I didn't know I was making, and corrected them before I'd finished making them. We worked 2 hours that first night and cut maybe 6 strips, and every one of them she made me redo at least once. When I left, she said only, "Thursday again, and bring more hide than you think you'll need," and closed the door before I'd gotten back to the wagon, already listening, I imagined, for the sound of the wheels pulling away to tell her I'd actually gone. By the second week of November, I'd started counting Thursdays the way I used to count feed sacks, a number I needed to keep straight because everything else depended on it. Tuesday and Thursday nights, after the stock was fed and the barn checked twice for anything that might catch fire, I drove into town with a load of scrap hide in the wagon bed and came back 3 hours later with my hands smelling of neatsfoot oil and my knuckles raw from the blade. She never asked about the ranch, never asked about my mother, or the bank, or the wool prices, though I suspect she knew about all three, the way she seemed to know everything, through the grapevine of women who ran the church suppers and the men who talked too loud at the feed store counter. What she asked about was the hide. Was it cowhide or sheep? Was it tanned soft or left stiff? Had I split it evenly or let one edge run thin? She built her questions like a woman building a fence, one post at a time, and she wasn't satisfied until every post was set. By Thanksgiving, I could cut a straight strip without her hand over mine, though she still ran her fingers along the edge afterward, checking, the way my father used to check a fence line by walking it rather than looking at it from the truck. "Even," she'd say, or "there," touching a spot no wider than a matchstick where the blade had wandered, and I never once caught the flaw myself before she found it. The barn nights started the first week of December, when the ground froze hard enough that the drive out was smoother than the drive in had been on the rutted fall roads. I'd bring her out in the wagon, bundled in a quilt that had been her husband's, and set 2 lamps on the workbench where my father's tools still hung on their nails, the awl with my grandfather's initials right there above her head, though she couldn't have seen it if I'd held it an inch from her eyes. She worked by smell and by sound as much as by touch. She could tell, she said, when the oil had soaked in enough by the way the hide breathed under her palm, a thing she couldn't explain further and I never asked her to. We braided our first 4-strand round that second week of December, working past midnight while the wind came up outside and rattled the loose tin on the north side of the barn. She made me pull the strands twice as tight as felt natural. "Loose braids look fine and fail," she said. "Tight braids look ugly for about a week, and then they don't." I hung that first braid on the fence by the gate the next morning, mostly because I had nowhere else to put it, and forgot about it entirely until the Saturday a stranger's truck slowed down on the county road to look at it twice. The truck belonged to a man I hadn't seen before, driving slow enough that gravel didn't even rise behind his tires, and he pulled onto the shoulder about 40 yards past the gate before backing up to look again. I was mending fence on the west line at the time and didn't think much of it. Men slowed down for all kinds of reasons on that road. A loose calf, a flat, a man reading a mailbox for a name he half remembered. But this one got out. He walked up to the fence in a canvas coat and a hat that had seen weather I hadn't, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets, studying that single braid like it owed him money. I came over because it seemed the thing to do, and he asked me who'd made it. I told him I had. He asked me who'd taught me, and I told him that too, though I didn't give her name, only that she'd learned it from her husband, who'd been dead 5 years and braiding 30 before that. The man turned the lariat over in his hands, ran his thumb down the lay of the strands the way she'd shown me to check a braid's pull, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said it was the tightest 4-strand he'd seen outside of a shop in Cheyenne, meaning his own, I understood later, though he didn't say that part either. He said his name was Delacroix Marsh, out of Denver, a saddle maker who came through Wyoming every December for the county rodeo circuit to buy tack and talk to ranchers who might sell him hides, rope, anything worth carrying back on the train. He asked how many I could make in a season. I told him honestly I didn't know, because I'd made exactly one, and he laughed at that in a short way that wasn't unkind, more like a man laughing at his own habit of expecting more than what stood in front of him. He didn't order anything that day. He wrote a number on the back of a feed receipt he had folded in his coat pocket, told me to think on it, and said he'd be back through in a week's time on his way home from the rodeo grounds. Then he got back in his truck and drove on toward town without asking to see the barn, or the widow, or anything else that would have told him what he was really looking at. I didn't tell her about it that night when I drove out to fetch her for our Tuesday session. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to be sure it was real before I let her hear it in my voice. The number on the feed receipt was 40 units at $12 apiece, delivery by the first week of March, and I read it 3 times under the kitchen lamp before I let myself believe the ink hadn't smeared into something I only wanted to see. $480. My mother's debt to the Stockman's Bank stood at $600 that week, unmoved since the winter before, and I did the arithmetic standing at the stove with the receipt still in my hand, the coffee going cold behind me. I told her on Thursday, 2 days later than I should have, driving out with her sitting straight in the truck seat, the way she always sat, hands folded over the cane she carried, more for the look of it than the need. I said the number out loud once we were past the second cattle guard, and she was quiet long enough that I thought the engine noise had carried it off before it reached her. 40, she said finally. Your grandfather made 40 in a year once, when he was younger than you and had 2 good eyes and no cattle to tend besides. I told her I had one made and 39 to go and 4 months to do it in, and she said that was time enough if I didn't waste my evenings driving out to fetch an old blind woman who could just as well tell you the same things over a supper table. I told her the barn light was better for the eyes than her kitchen lamp, which wasn't true, but she let it stand. We worked later that night than usual. She had me lay out 4 hides at once instead of 1, cutting them into strands while she sat with her hands in her lap listening to the knife, correcting me by the sound of it dragging instead of cutting clean. She said a blade that drags is a blade that's dull or a wrist that's tired, and mine was the second, not the first, and I should quit before I ruined good hide out of stubbornness. I didn't quit. She didn't tell me to again either. Driving her home past 11, the road empty and the frost already silvering the fence wire in the headlamps, she asked me what the saddle maker's face had done when I told him I'd made exactly one. I said he laughed, not unkind, more like a man surprised by his own hopefulness. She was quiet again, and then she said that was the only kind of laughing worth trusting, and that I should remember the sound of it, because men didn't laugh that way twice in a season, and I would want to know it again if I ever heard it. I said I would remember it. I did not tell her, that night or any night after, how close the number had come to matching the exact figure my mother owed the bank. The second week of January came in hard. 10 below on the Tuesday morning, the tannery owner drove out to the ranch himself, which he had not done in 9 years of hauling. He came in a 1947 Ford pickup with the tannery's name painted fresh on the door, and he did not get out right away, just sat with the engine running and the exhaust hanging white in the cold while I finished feeding. When he did step down, he kept his gloves on and his collar up and told me, without much preamble, that the scrap price was going to $15 a load starting the 1st of February on account of what he called rising costs, though the tannery hadn't changed its process in as long as I'd known it. I asked him which costs. He said overhead and looked past me at the shed, where 6 finished lariats and a length of harness leather hung drying on nails along the wall, and I understood then that the number wasn't about overhead at all. I told him I'd think on it. He said there wasn't much to think on, that I'd been hauling his scrap at $3 since I was 9 years old and ought to be grateful he hadn't raised it sooner. That was true as far as it went. I didn't argue it. I only said I'd let him know by the weekend, and he drove off with the tannery's name gleaming on the door in the flat morning light, and I stood there a while longer than the cold called for. I wrote to a tannery in Fort Collins, Colorado, that Thursday, a hide and leather works I'd seen mentioned once in a stockman's bulletin my father used to keep, and I asked what they charged to haul off their own scrap and trimmings. The answer came back the following week, slower than I liked but honest. $2 a load, less than Cheyenne had ever charged. On account of the distance, nobody wanted to drive for it. 51 miles each way was a long haul for a wagon that used to be a 14-mile round trip, but the truck could make it in under 2 hours if the road held, and the hide was the same hide underneath, cattle and sheep both, cured the same way by men who'd learned it from the same kind of fathers. I did not tell the tannery owner where the new scrap was coming from. I told him only, that Saturday, standing at his own counter with my hat still on, that I'd pay what I'd always paid, or I'd pay nothing at all, and he could decide which. He said I'd regret it inside a season. I said that was possible. Then I drove west instead of south the following Monday, toward Fort Collins, with an empty wagon and a full tank, and I did not look back at the tannery's sign in the mirror even once. The Fort Collins scrap came in stiffer than Cheyenne's, more lime in the cure, and it took me 2 weeks of ruined trimmings before I learned to soak it an hour longer than she'd taught me and work it while it still held some give. I did not have her hands to check my work anymore. I had her voice in my head instead, telling me the leather would tell me when it was ready, that I didn't need eyes for that, only patience. And I found she was right about that, the same way she'd been right about everything else. The braiding shed, what had been the old equipment lean-to before I closed in the north side and ran a stovepipe through the roof, stayed lit most nights that February. My mother brought coffee out at 9 and again at 11, and she didn't say anything about the hours anymore, not since the Denver order money had started arriving in installments, $12 a lariat, 4 already sent by wire through the stockman's bank as proof against the note. Mr. Pruitt at the bank had taken to nodding at me on the street instead of asking after Mother's account. That was as much as I'd wanted from him since the beginning. The tannery owner did not come back around that winter. I heard through the feed store that he'd tried to sell scrap to a saddler in Torrington and been turned down, the man already stocked from a supplier out of Nebraska, and that he'd started burning his own trimmings again the way I used to, out behind the tannery in a pit he had to pay a boy 50 cents a week to tend. I did not feel much when I heard that. I want to say I felt nothing at all, but that would not be honest, and honesty is the only thing I promised myself I'd keep straight through all of this. I felt the particular satisfaction of a debt settled in a currency the other man didn't know he owed. By the first week of March, the count stood at 31 lariats finished, coiled and tagged in the shed, waiting on 9 more before the shipment went out. I worked most evenings alone now, the awl warm in my palm from an hour's use, before I ever noticed the cold, my grandfather's initials worn shallow, under my thumb, where 3 generations of the same grip had passed over them. I kept expecting to hear the truck on the drive some Tuesday, expecting her to be brought out one more time to run her fingers along a coil and tell me where I'd rushed a splice. The truck never came. I braided anyway, the same 4-strand pattern she'd guided into my hands in November, and if I closed my eyes while I worked, which I did, more than once, though there was no reason to, the shed lit plain and yellow around me. I could not have told you, by feel alone, whose hands were on the leather. The last 9 came together in 11 days, and on the 18th of March, a Tuesday, I drove all 40 lariats into Cheyenne myself, wrapped in burlap and packed 2 to a crate, and watched the station agent weigh the crates and write the manifest for Denver in a hand almost as careful as hers had been. $480, less freight, less the 6% the saddlemaker's man had held back for delay. I did the figures twice on the ledger page my father had started and my grandfather before him, and the number that came out square against the 600 owed to the bank was not exact to the dollar, but it was close enough that the difference didn't trouble me, and it didn't trouble the loan officer either when I laid the bank draft on his desk on the 22nd and asked him to mark the account paid. He didn't ask where the money had come from. Men rarely ask, once the number in front of them is correct. The tannery owner came out once more, in April, standing at the gate the way he always had, hat pushed back, waiting for me to walk up rather than walking in. He said the Fort Collins outfit was underpricing him on purpose, said a man in his position couldn't compete against a boy with no overhead, said perhaps we could go back to the old arrangement, the $3, and he'd throw in the good scrap first before the Denver buyers had a look at it. I told him I had all the scrap I needed and thanked him for his time, and he stood there another moment working his jaw like there was something else he meant to say, and then he got in his truck and drove back toward town, and that was the last I saw of him for a good while. The shed still runs. Sheep and cattle first, same as always. 90 head and 40 head and the counting that never really stops. But 2 evenings most weeks, and more in the winter. I'm out there past dark with the all warm in my hand, and the orders come steadier now. Denver, then Casper, then a saddler up in Sheridan who heard about the lariats from a man at a rodeo. My mother doesn't carry the bank's letters folded in her apron pocket anymore. I keep the ledger current, keep the tools oiled, keep the 4-strand pattern exact the way it was taught to me. If you've got a shed or a drawer nobody's opened in 40 years, go open it. You might find you're not too young or too green for what's inside. You might just be the only one paying attention. Tell me what you found. I'll read every one.